In 2014, the great-great-grandson of Avil McGowan released a prophecy, revealed a prophecy that McGowan had written in 1794. And the prophecy said that when the Russians invade Crimea, put on your Shabbat clothes because the Messiah is near. It was a very messianic prophecy, and it's something about when Russia invades Istanbul, then you know Messiah's at the gate. So that was real. That really happened in 2014. When I got the idea of Avil McGowan and I found out about this prophecy, my thought was, well, what if McGowan had written a second prophecy? And what if that prophecy was something that also had a messianic content to it and would play into this whole idea of these rising empires, and how would that trigger things? And so we set the book, the series, in 2014, not long after the first prophecy was revealed.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Terry Brennan, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Ishmael Covenant, which is book number 1 in the Empires of Armageddon series. Terry, it's been a long time, my friend. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It's a pleasure. It's good talking to you again.
We talked about this actually before we got into the interview. It's been 5 years since we talked, and lo and behold, I have a lot of new people that have started following the podcast since then. So let's start our conversation, I think the same place we did several years back, and that's with a bit of what we might call the Terry Brennan origin story. So for the listeners who are encountering you for the very first time in our talk today, tell us a few things that they absolutely need to know about you. Well,
I've been married to my wife, Andrea, for 40 years. This is really the sweetest season of our marriage, which has been awesome. We moved to Danbury, Connecticut about 3 years ago, a nice little home, and we're 7 minutes away from our grandkids, so that's an awesome thing too. So I really had 3 significant careers. I was a journalist for 20 years. I was a sports writer, and then I became an editor and a publisher of newspapers in Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois, and worked for a while with the executive editor of an international newspaper company that had 400 newspapers in the U.S. and Ireland and England. And I was executive editor of all of the U.S. newspapers. So the newspaper career was great. It was a lot of fun. Being a sports writer was an awesome job, except it keeps you on the road too much. It's really not good for a guy with a family. So that's why I got out of out of sports writing and into newspaper management. I guess one of the highlights of my newspaper career was when I was editor of the Mercury in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Led a team of people to a Pulitzer Prize in editorial writing for a series that we did when I was there. So that was the thrill. And then God took this huge left turn in our lives, and I went to work for the Bowery Mission in New York City, down the Lower East Side of New York City. Bowery Mission is a ministry to homeless men right off the streets. If people have heard stories about the Bowery, that all that stuff was true. And we just dealt with the guys who are addicted to alcohol, drugs, whatever, living on the street for a long time, try to bring them in and clean them up, give them a chance to change their hearts, change their lives. Did that. I worked at the Bowery Mission for 12 years. My wife and I lived in the mission for 7 years. Then I went to work for another agency in New York that works with homeless people, Care for the Homeless, delivers medical teams to drop-in shelters and soup kitchens around the city. So I spent 20 years working with homeless people, with agencies that work with homeless people in New York City. And then about 2005, I started writing novels. And the first series, I think the first book of the first series came out in 2008. So I've been writing novels for 15 years. It takes me a long time to write books, but so I've had really 3 major careers, and hopefully the novel writing will go on a little longer. But I retired in 2016, so now I'm living a life of leisure, right?
Sounds like it. I'm curious, in terms of that first series, or that first trilogy actually would be a better way to say it, what made you decide to get into writing fiction? Had you written fiction to any degree before that, or was this a new pursuit for you?
It was new. I think when I was working in the nonprofit agencies down in New York City, working with homeless people, I still had the itch to write. God's made me a writer. That's the gift He gave me. I was born that way, and I had to exercise it somehow. So I wrote a book And it was sitting in a drawer for a long time, and finally decided to check it out, see if it was worth anything. I went to a writer's conference, and it didn't take me long enough to find out that nobody should ever see that book. I mean, you write novels in a totally different way than you write newspapers. But I had an idea, and I was at this writer's conference. I had an idea, and I started kicking the idea around with other people, and they said, "That's a great idea. You need to write that book." And so I went home, and I spent a year of Saturdays writing a book that ended up being The Sacred Cipher, which is the first book of the Jerusalem Prophecy series, even though it was never intended to be a series. I had one idea. I wrote one book. I thought that was it. And then people kept asking me, "Well, when's the sequel coming out? When's the sequel coming out?" I said, "I don't know. I've got no sequel." But there were enough questions, so I figured I better write one. And that took me 4 years to write the second book. And then the story just naturally led into a conclusion of the third book. So Jerusalem Prophecies as a trilogy, as a series, really was birthed on the go. Just sort of came along, and it was a lot of fun. So what I read, I always read action-adventure stories. I read historical fiction, quest novels, where they're looking for the ancient, or even when I was a kid, I was in high school. It's just the kind of book that I would gravitate towards. So I ended up writing the kinds of stuff that I like to read.
And if you're listening to this and you haven't read Terry's first series, that was actually how Terry and I first connected, and I can vouch for that. All of the books in that series are absolutely fantastic. So in addition to checking out the new series, I would encourage you to check out that previous series as well. Terry, I'd be curious to hear the story behind this new book, even the new series, if you will. What kind of sparked the ideas that got you moving in the direction of Empires of Armageddon?
As I said before, for Sacred Cipher, I had one idea, and it just sort of sparked it. And the same thing happened with Empires of Armageddon. I had basically one idea that I was kicking around, and that was that it seemed to me that there are three ancient empires that are stirring up in the Middle East, that seem to be on the rise again in the Middle East. And those empires were the Persian Empire, which was Iran and Iraq together in the past. It was the Empire of Persia. The Islamic Empire seems to be rising. It's particularly the strength of the Saudi oil millions. And then there's the Ottoman Empire that came out of Turkey. And all these empires all occupied basically the same slice of land, from the northern part of Turkey down through Syria and Lebanon and into Jordan and Israel and down into the upper reaches of Egypt and part of Saudi Arabia. They spread from other places, but each of those empires occupied that same space. And there's one of the beliefs in Islam is that if a country has occupied a part of the world, a slice of land, if Islam has controlled any slice of the earth at any time, then it controls it all the time. It belongs to it all the time. So when the Ottoman Empire occupied that part of the Fertile Crescent from Turkey down through Syria and Israel and then over to Egypt, they considered that belongs to them forever. But the Persians had the same idea. That belonged to them forever. And when Islam grew and ruled the world from India all the way over to Spain, they had the same belief that land belongs to them forever. Well, if the Islamic Empire is beginning to rise and the Persian Empire is beginning to rise and the Ottoman Empire is beginning to rise, they're all going to claim the same land, which would happen to be that Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, which is at the center of much of the conflict in the world today. And my thought was, if that's true, if those empires really do resurrect themselves, then what's that going to mean for today? What would that mean for Israel? What would that mean for the Middle East? And how would that conflict impact the world that we are facing today? So I had that idea, and I went to visit a assistant pastor at our church, a guy named Nick Uva, who's really well-read, knowledgeable guy. And we started kicking around the idea and talking about lots of different stuff. My wife and I were there. We spent a couple hours just talking about the whole concept of these empires. And at one point he asked me, he turned to me and said, "Have you ever heard of the Vilna Gaon?" And I said, "No, what is that?" And he started telling me about this guy who was an ancient Talmudic scholar. He was the most renowned scholar, Jewish scholar of his time back in the late 1700s. So I went off and I started reading up on him. And it was a combination of the idea of the empires rising and this guy, the Vilna Gaon. When those two things came together, it really was a spark that got me running with the whole series.
Terry, one of the things that I've always seen as a hallmark of your writing is you have this great capability to really immerse a person in the story. I feel like you give just the right amount of details to make the pictures, the scenes you're painting very vivid. And so I'm curious, in terms of this new book, were you able to spend any time on location for some of the places that you'll be taking us in the story?
Not as many as I would like, but my wife and I spent a good bit of time in Israel in 2011. So we got to visit a lot of the scenes, the areas that I was writing about in this series. A good bit of it takes place in Israel, in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So I had much better knowledge of that area after being there for quite some time. Never have been to Turkey, to Istanbul, or to Ankara. So there are parts of it that I just do research on. And the time we spent in Israel was really worthwhile because it really put a lot of things in perspective for me, not just geographically, but for the people there and their culture and the things that they face every day. So that was really helpful.
Well, before we get to you introducing us to the main character in the book, I'd love to have you just give us a little bit more detail. Have you set the stage? What's the world that you're drawing us into? What are some of the conflicts, things happening in the news that sort of kick off the adventure that we're going to go on in your book?
In 2014, the great-great-grandson of the Vilna Gaon released a prophecy, revealed a prophecy that the Gaon had written in 1794. And the prophecy said that when the Russians invade Crimea, put on your Shabbat clothes because the Messiah is near. It was a very messianic prophecy, and it's something about when Russia invades Istanbul, then you know Messiah's at the gate. So that was real. That really happened in 2014. When I got the idea of the Vilna Gaon and I found out about this prophecy, my thought was, well, what if the Gaon had written a second prophecy? And what if that prophecy was something that also had a messianic content to it and would play into this whole idea of these rising empires, and how would that trigger things? And so we set the book, the series, in 2014, not long after the first prophecy was revealed. And at that time, one of the protagonists, a guy named Brian Mullaney, who works for the Diplomatic Security Service, which is the agency that protects the U.S. diplomatic corps and the foreign service people overseas all around the world. He was working for the Diplomatic Security Service, and the secondary character is a guy named Joseph Cleveland, who is, at the time, was the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. And Cleveland meets an old friend of his in Turkey, in Istanbul, a rabbi, who asked Cleveland to take the Vilna Gaon's second prophecy, which has been hidden in a synagogue in Istanbul for over 200 years, to take it to Israel with him and to deliver it to the Rabbinic Council in Israel, because they would be able to decipher it and figure out because they figured it was in code, but nobody's ever known really what was in it. And the prophecy is held in a metal box, and the metal box has the power. Anybody who touches it without the anointing experiences instant death. And so the metal box is contained inside a wooden container. But he asked Cleveland to take the prophecy to Israel when he goes, because Cleveland has been transferred from Turkey to being the new ambassador to Israel. And Mullaney gets reassigned from the duties he had in Washington to be the regional security officer for the Middle East, and particularly to have responsibility for taking care of Cleveland, for protecting Cleveland and the entire Foreign Service Corps in Israel. So they connect up, and the conflict really comes where there are two really incarnate evil. One is the guy named the Turk, and the other is his superior, his ruler is called the One. And they are immortal created beings, just like angels are immortal created beings. But these are evil created beings, and they've been pursuing the Gaon's prophecies for over 200 years, because they are concerned with what's the content of the prophecies will thwart the plans that they have. And this is where the underlying theme for the whole series comes in. These guys, the Turk and the One, they believe that if they can thwart one prophecy of the Bible, one messianic prophecy, if they can prevent that prophecy from being fulfilled, then it will invalidate all the prophecies in the Bible, all the messianic prophecies in the Bible. And if they can do that, then they can rewrite the end of the book. They can rewrite the end of the Bible, and they can reverse the Battle of Armageddon. They can reverse the results of the Battle of Armageddon and get victory. So they're pursuing these prophecies because they think if what's in the prophecies becomes known, then it'll prevent them from fulfilling their plans, which is to block the messianic prophecies. So Mulaney in Cleveland, since Cleveland has the box, they get caught up in this. They're right in the middle of it, and these bad guys they got a ruthless bunch of killers that the Turk has organized and rules. They're called the Disciples, and the Disciples just start trying to destroy and kill anybody who has the box or is around the box or might impede them from getting the box or the prophecy. So it's a real good versus evil story with the whole idea of spiritual warfare going on.
In addition to spiritual warfare, I like that you have a sort of an Ark of the Covenant vibe with the box there. That's fantastic. In terms of your main character, Brian, I would anticipate that, as he's thrown into this mix and encountering kind of these dark spiritual beings, these maybe even demonic characters, if you will, I'd be curious to hear if that brings up some challenges for him faith-wise, or if he has to wrestle with some worldview issues as he's coming to terms with what he's facing.
Brian Mulaney he's come out of a family of guys who work for the Virginia State Police. His father worked for Virginia State Police. He did for a long time, his brother does. And then he got recruited by the Diplomatic Security Service of the State Department to come and be part of that. And his father never forgave him for leaving the state police. So when Mulaney gets reassigned to Israel, he's really dealing with a number of challenges. He was wrongly accused of something or tarred by an incident that happened and really was scapegoated and pushed out of the position he held in Washington and sent to Israel, which really put a lot of strain on his marriage. He had promised his wife and his kids that they would never have to move again, or he would leave the State Department because they had moved around 12 times in the 20 years they were married. And so his marriage is on the rocks. His wife has kept the girls, and she has stayed back in Washington when Mulaney goes to Israel. And he's also dealing with a lot of regret and grief that his father had passed away. He was in a coma from Alzheimer's related coma, and he never got to get forgiveness from his father for leaving the state police. And his father had just recently passed away. So his world is really on edge. The main pillars that hold him up, his work, his marriage, his relation with his family, all of those things are in really bad shape. And then he gets sent over to Israel. And he finds himself up against and facing these disciples. These murderous thugs are just killing people left and right and trying to kidnap the ambassador's daughter. And so it's one crisis after another that he comes into. One of the results of the friction in the Middle East and particularly the rise of the Persian Empire, is that the Israelis and the Saudis are really getting closer. They're getting closer and closer in their relationships. But what I pose in the book, in the first book particularly, is that the Saudis and the rest of the Arab states along the Gulf and Jordan that are so concerned about Iran and Iran's attempts to get nuclear weapons, and that the influence that Iran is pursuing all around the Middle East, that it pushes the Saudis and the Arab states into a peace treaty and a mutual defense pact with Israel, which is the Ishmael Covenant. It's the sons of Ishmael and Isaac coming together in a bond of peace and in a bond that says we'll protect each other. And the whole idea of when the Ishmael Covenant is signed, it really throws the Middle East into a big upheaval, because there's a lot of people who want to see that happen, a lot of people who don't. Part of the deal is that there'll be an independent Palestinian state. So it causes a lot of conflict. So Mulaney's thrown into this cauldron of both geopolitical conflict in his family and his home life. These murderers are trying to kill him and the ambassador and anybody that's around there. And it's just straining all of his foundational beliefs. And he finds himself in a position several times where he just is broken and he's on his knees and crying out to God, saying, what's going on? What do I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I want to talk to you anymore. Everything's gone wrong. And you promised me to take care of me. And so he's really at the end of his wits, and where God really steps in and helps him out. In fact, where we have these eternal created beings of evil, there are eternal created beings of good who come to bear and come to play in all this and really help, get involved in the same spiritual warfare on the side of Mulaney and the ambassador, and trying to help them fight off the Turk and the one and the evil that they're facing.
Well, I'm encouraged to know that God and the hosts of heaven will not leave Brian hanging as he is going on his journey. Big picture wise, in terms of the reader's journey as we are on mission with Brian throughout Ishmael Covenant, what are some of the key feelings and thoughts that you hope to plant in the mind of the reader? Because on the one hand, I realize this is a novel and you're trying to tell a story, but at the same time, there are always kind of those core sort of worldview ideas or issues that you're trying to tackle. So I guess a better way to say it might be, when the reader finishes the book, what are those one or two core ideas you hope every single reader comes away with?
The one is that the world that we're in, particularly, is very fragile, particularly in the Middle East, which is where the end is going to be. I mean, we see the impact and the implications of end times around us all the time. We don't know. I mean, when Israel became a state in 1948, that started the clock. We don't know when that clock is. We don't know where we are on the timeline. But the Middle East is like a powder keg, and it's the middle of whatever's going to happen in the future, whatever God's plan and purpose in the future. The Middle East is going to be involved. Jerusalem's going to be involved. The conflict of good and evil in that Middle Eastern area is key to the end of the Bible and how things are going to work out. So one of the things I hope the readers will come away with is a better understanding of how current politics, current history, the things that are going on today, how that plays into and impacts what we read in the Bible and where we are. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm certainly not trying to predict anything, but I like to take a look at what Scripture says, what prophecy says, and where we're going, and how does today's world fit into that scenario, and where might we be in that timeline. So I like to play around with that. I like to take that and use it and twist it and to make a good story out of it. The other thing that I hope the readers come away with is this whole idea of spiritual warfare. My wife gave me a Bible many, many years ago. It's an NIV study Bible. And in Ephesians, Paul talks about heavenly realms. And there's a long NIV study note at the end of chapter 1 in Ephesians about heavenly realms and the conflict, what he says about the titanic conflict between God and the spiritual forces that oppose him in heaven. And I started thinking about, and I read that not long before I started the book, what happens to us in this world because of our connection to the resurrected Christ, and that we're part of him. He's part of it, that we have an impact. What happens to us in this world has an impact in that titanic struggle of God against the spiritual forces arrayed against him in heaven. And I never really thought of that way. When something happens in my life, as Andrea and I, and our marriage is challenged in some way, or our kids are having a problem or whatever, we pray about, God, help us in this, and watch over our children, or give them protection, or whatever it might be. We're praying about the things that are happening to us on a regular basis. I mean, that's part of our lives. Our prayer life is critical to us. We pray about everything. But I never thought about it as far as how is this, what we face today, how is that impacting this struggle of good against evil that's going on in the heavenlies? And what Paul is telling us is it is connected. There is a connection. So what I'm hoping that the readers will come away with is that the challenges that we face individually in this life, on this planet, are not only challenges for us, but they're challenges that have an eternal impact. And we need to be thinking, it'd be good for us all to be thinking more heavenly, eternally, I don't know. So just to have a concept that what's going on, it's not just us. We're not in this by ourselves, obviously, but it's not just us. It doesn't just have to do with us. It has a lot more eternal impact than we really give it credit for.
And Terry, can you give us a sense of what the date range ETA might be for book 2 in the series, and maybe a sneak peek of where you're going to take us as we go further on the journey?
Okay. Persian Betrayal is the second book in the series, and that's scheduled for release on July 28th. And the third book in the series, the final book in the series, is called Ottoman Dominion, and that will come out probably somewhere between 6 to 9 months after Persian Betrayal. And the story, it's a very short time frame from when it all happens in 2014, it all happens in July of 2014 over a very condensed period of time. So things are moving. Everything's moving fast. And the one book reads right into the second book. In fact, the first chapter of the second book is in the back of the first book, so you get an idea how things keep moving. And really what carries through in the 3 books is how Brian Mullaney is in the middle of trying to fulfill his duty both to his wife and his children, to the government that he serves and that the ambassador try to keep them safe, but also his duty as a Christian man in facing against incarnate evil. And what is his role? And he finds that he's been called to this, and he receives the anointing. The person who has the box has been passed down from generation to generation is called the guardian, and the guardian receives the anointing of the Aaronic blessing, and that which allows them to stay safe around the box and the prophecy. Mulaney's the last guardian, and the blessing is passed along to him, and he has destiny that's been determined from long before he was born. This is going to be his role, part of his role, which he certainly had no idea, but he's thrown into it. And the arc of the story, the drama is watching Mulaney deal with all these different conflicts in his life and how he finds that he has a purpose that's beyond what he expected, and that his purpose has an eternal impact and has a supernatural impact, and how that plays out in his life and the lives of all those people around him. And I think that's about it.
Well, Terry, this certainly sounds like another home run. Like I said, I loved Terry's previous series. It's fantastic. And I think the Empires of Armageddon series is going to be received just as well, if not better. So I highly encourage you to check out all of Terry's books, which are available everywhere great books are sold. Terry, for the listeners right now who want to connect with you, find out more about your books, where are some of the places we can connect with you on the web?
I'm on Facebook. You just search for Terry Brennan. You can find me on Facebook. My website is terrybrennanauthor.com. You can catch up with me on Twitter. That's where, particularly on the website, I have a lot of information on the stuff that's in the books, stuff that is real stuff, and some of the history that I weave into these books. So terrybrennanauthor.com is where they can grab me.
Well, like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Terry and pick up your own copies of his fantastic books. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Terry Brennan. Once again, our book today was The Ishmael Covenant. That's book number 1 in the Empires of Armageddon series. For more on Terry and his books, a great place to start is his website. Once again, you can find that at terrybrennanauthor.com. And Terry, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate your help.